Welcome to a new series called Did You Know? We finished studying the Bible, Genesis through Revelation. It took us 8 years. So now we're going to go back through it, but we're going to just do some fun facts. Hopefully it won't take us 8 years. Just things that we've discovered that maybe you haven't, so then you'll learn something new. And so the first one I'm going to do now is from Genesis 2 and also chapter 3. Did you know that Eve thought that the tree that she was not supposed to eat from was the tree of life, not the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? And the way I get that is in Genesis 2, verse 8. It says, "And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. And out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil." So that verse there tells you that God made all these trees, and there are only 2 trees identified outside. All these trees are good for food, but then there are 2 trees that are special. One is the tree of life, which is in the midst of the garden. And then there is also the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Well, when Satan comes to tempt Eve in Genesis chapter 3, in verse 1, he said unto the woman, "Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said unto the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden." Verse 3, "But of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God hath said, Ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die." From Genesis 2:9, we learn that the tree of life is in the midst of the garden. It's the only tree identified by God as being in the midst of the garden. So when Eve says in Genesis 3:3, "But of the fruit of the tree, which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, Ye shall not eat of it." So what it leads me to believe, and I'm not 100% sure, but pretty close to that, is that Eve thought that she was not allowed to eat of the tree of life. And probably the reason, we do know that they did not eat of the tree of life, because you look in Genesis 3, verse 22, after they sinned. "The Lord God said, Behold, the man is become as one of us to know good and evil. And now, lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever." It shows that man ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but he didn't eat of the tree of life. And so what happens, and you go back to Genesis 3, verse 4. Well, first you look in Genesis 2 and verse 17. God said, "Of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die." Well, when Eve was asked the question by the serpent in Genesis 3:1 about did God say you can't eat of that you can eat of every tree of the garden, Eve responded, "Yeah, we can eat of every tree except," verse 3, "the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden. God has said, Ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die." You can see a bad doctrine there. She added, "Neither shall ye touch it." And she also said, "Lest ye die," when God said in Genesis 2:17, "Thou shalt surely die." And you notice the serpent's response in Genesis 3:4. The serpent said unto the woman, "Ye shall not surely die." So the serpent corrected her bad doctrine there. And so it appears in verse 5 that he also corrected the bad doctrine in terms of which tree it is. Because he says in Genesis 3:5, "For God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be open, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil." So I believe that Eve thought she couldn't eat of the tree of life, and she really couldn't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And Satan corrected her false doctrine, saying it's really the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the reason I think she thought it was the tree of life, because she said the tree which is in the midst of the garden, and the only one identified as the tree in the midst of the garden is the tree of life. According to Revelation 22, there are rivers running around it. The tree of life, it says, Revelation 22:2, in the midst of the street of it, meaning in the midst of New Jerusalem, and of either side of the river was there the tree of life, which bare 12 manner of fruits, and yielded her fruit every month, and the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. So there's this, the tree of life is set aside, and it's by the river. So it appears then that's what took place in the Garden of Eden. God set that tree of life in the middle, and it's right by the river. And I think the reason they didn't eat of that tree is because God says in 2 Corinthians 5:7, we walk by faith and not by sight. When David is elected king, God says, I don't look on his outward appearance. God does not judge as man does on the outward appearance. I look on the heart. And so God takes a little shepherd boy, David, and makes him king. Based on the fact that without faith it is impossible to please God, and he wants us to walk by faith, it makes sense that the tree of life would be some ugly looking tree. But it would have life on it, because then you walk by faith. And that's probably why Adam and Eve didn't eat of it. All the trees probably looked good, except for the tree of life probably looked ugly. And so they would have to walk by faith to eat of that tree, but they didn't. You notice in Genesis 3:6, when it came to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil looked good on the outside. Chances are the tree of life did not look good on the outside. It wasn't pleasant. The fruit didn't look good. And it would take faith to eat of that tree. That's just based upon biblical principles that I know it's an educated guess. So that's probably why they didn't eat of it. So anyway, there you go. The woman was probably deceived and thought that the tree that she should not eat of is the tree of life. All right. Thanks for watching. Did you know? Number 1.